Welcome, everyone.
All right, welcome everybody. I am Codi Conway. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for K-8 at Washington Grade School District 52 in Washington. I'm extremely excited to be here with you today to share our portion on language comprehension. If you were with us last month with a focus on foundational skills, the first part of our presentation will be a little bit of a review about science of reading, and then we'll really dig into language comprehension in the next portion.
Hi, and I'm Heather Bowman. I'm the principal here at Lincoln Grade School in Washington, Grade School District 52. This is the start of my 6th year here as building principal. In my teaching career, I've taught 2nd grade, kindergarten, and was a literacy specialist as well.
Hi, my name is Jill Hibbard, and I am the Lincoln Grade School kindergarten through 2nd grade intervention specialist. And we are super excited to share with you a little bit about our journey and what we have learned about the comprehension piece.
All right, so we started with the warm-up of you recording your one word to describe your thoughts and feelings about science of reading in the chat. We always like to start with this just because of all the conversations we've had around the science of reading with various colleagues, educators, administrators, and we know that there are a lot of feelings around it. And so we don't want to pass those by and not validate those feelings. So Natalie Wexler does a really good job in one of her webinars on the knowledge gap, really identifying and summing up the obstacles that educators are facing around the science of reading in 3 main ways. And so I know some of you put that you're very hopeful and you're very positive. Others put that you're curious. Some put that you're overwhelmed. And so we just want you to know that all of these feelings are completely relevant and completely normal. And those feelings should be validated because we've definitely all felt them before. And we're still continuing to feel them as time goes on and we continue to learn more. So the first obstacle that we really see people face is that intellectual obstacle, which is an obstacle of the mind. And that's something that I feel like we encounter frequently as educators as things are constantly evolving and changing. And it's when something is really unfamiliar to us. So the science of reading research really hasn't been in practice for a long time in a lot of places. Maybe in some of your districts it has, but for us, we really haven't had it, and it's kind of been a nationwide issue. And so when there's something that comes along in legislation and in mandates, and all of a sudden it's popping up all over the place that you haven't learned in your pre-service training and you haven't learned in your continuing education or in your current role, and it goes against everything that you've ever done, it's very natural to be skeptical. And so we definitely want to validate those feelings and thoughts because we have at some point in our journey felt them as well.
There's also obstacles of the heart. Teaching reading is very emotional. We want to do what's best for our students, and it tugs on your heart to be told that maybe what you were doing for all of these years might not be in line with how kids best learn to read. And that can be really hard. I taught for 17 years kindergarten and 2nd grade, and I taught balanced literacy, and then moved into a new role and did more research. And at first it was really, really hard for me to realize that maybe how I was teaching reading wasn't following really what the science is telling us. And then teaching reading is also very personal. We care for our students and we want to do what's best for them. So just know that those feelings are very, very natural.
And then we have the obstacles of behavioral or habitual things. You know, some of you have maybe been teaching for 20 plus years. You have your lesson plans. You have everything laid out the way you're used to doing it. And maybe from year to year, you just make certain tweaks based off of your data or certain things that are popping up with kids. And we realize that it's hard to change. It's hard to embrace new things, especially when you've been doing them for a long time. So overcoming those behavioral obstacles, we realize, are a definite challenge.
Next, we'd like to just give a little bit of an overview of our journey here in District 52. We have really spent the last 3 years delving into the science of reading research and really adjusting our practices to be in line with it. And it's been a 3-year process for us. So I'm not going to read all of this to you. I more show this just so that you know wherever you are in your district, it's okay. Every district is unique in its own way. Some of you might be further ahead. Some of you may have not even started. This might be your first encounter with learning about the science of reading. And wherever you are in your journey, it's completely okay. We started in our district with a lot of professional development and making small adjustments. And now fast forward 3 years later, we're a full structured literacy model, complete with systematic and explicit instruction and foundational skills and language comprehension. And so just know that everybody's journey is your own, and it's just going to take ongoing effort, sustained PD, really understanding the why and getting your staff and teachers to understand the why, and continuous learning to be able to really make a shift that's going to be in the best benefit for the students. Our session objectives today are to discover what the science of reading is and is not. So again, if you were in our webinar last month, we went over some of these things. We're going to hit them again because they're still important with the language comprehension strand. We're going to talk about why science of reading is getting so much attention. We're going to reflect on traditional methods of teaching reading comprehension. So how as a nation have we been focusing on that in our classrooms? We're going to discover what is involved with language comprehension. What is it? What is made up of it? We're going to discover the basics of how our brains learn to comprehend text. We're going to showcase data to reflect the impact of the changes in our school and what we've seen in our students' reading comprehension, just to show that the practices we're actually putting into action, we're seeing that benefit in our data. And then hopefully you will walk away with some ideas to evaluate your current literacy practices and some ideas to begin making shifts in your school.
Okay, we're going to dive right in and talk a little bit about the science of reading and what it is not. It is not a fad, a trend. It's not a new idea or a pendulum swing. It's not a single specific component of instruction, such as phonics. It's more than just phonics. Phonics is one piece, and today we're going to kind of dive into the comprehension piece of it. It's not a literacy model in itself. It's not a program or an intervention you can buy, and it's not complete. So there's going to be more studying done on it. And so let's talk about what the science of reading is. Simply put, it is a collection of research that has been done over decades, and it answers the question of how does the brain best learn to read? The science of reading tells us how proficient reading and writing develop, and then why some students and some people have difficulty, and how can we most effectively assess, teach, and then improve our student outcomes. It is based on the 5 pillars of reading, the 5 big ideas: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And with this, you're all probably familiar with the 5 pillars, but it isn't just about the 5 pillars, but how they're implemented. And today we're really going to focus in on the vocabulary and the comprehension piece. The science of reading is ever evolving. And by that, I mean there's new research happening all the time. New research is happening just like any science. The other part is laws. State laws are evolving. And then within our own school, Codi shared a little bit about how our instruction is evolving. We started implementing just some small shifts about 2.5 years ago. And then each year our reading instruction has evolved to this year. Our reading instruction is completely based on, upon the science of reading and what we have learned. And we teach completely the structured literacy model now. And then finally, science of reading, this research is important for every grade level, and the structured literacy is important for every grade level. I know that a lot of times it seems like it is K2 focused, but really its focus is anyone who is learning to read or anyone who is reading to comprehend as well.
And I'll jump in there, Jill, too, because I taught 4th and 5th grade, and I talked to previously before I was an administrator, and I talked to so many teachers who are middle school or high school, and they're like, oh, the science of reading really doesn't apply to me. That's more elementary. And I would have been such a better teacher if I would have learned about this when I was teaching reading. And especially today, when we're talking about the vocabulary and comprehension portion, we're going to get into knowledge building and how important that is for when students get to junior high and high school. And so it's so important for us to look at it holistically, from a K-12 lens, and then also, post K-12 education as well, just as we're in college and learning to be teachers and all of that. It's very important for us to have an understanding of how the brain learns to read, because we're all in charge of that, no matter what level you're teaching at. So it's just very important for us to keep that in mind.
Okay, so why are we hearing about all of this now? So we've got some concerning data up here on this slide, and that first quote really just speaks to the fact that almost a quarter of adults, that comes from the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, struggle with literacy, struggle with being able to read a basic text or directions that come with a product or a shelving unit that they need to be able to put together. And then the biggest study that has brought up this concern has been the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So it states here that almost a third of students nationwide are described as below proficient in reading. And that carried through even to the 2022 assessment as well, where it came up there as well. Here in our state of Illinois, fourth graders on that IER test, we had did not or partially only met on the IAR there, 44%. And so those numbers are very concerning all around. This data on this next slide really shows from 1992, I believe, all the way to 2017, that reading scores have been very stagnant in our country. You take a look, we've got fourth graders denoted in red and eighth graders, they're in blue, and there hasn't been much growth. There hasn't been improvement. And so we need to really examine why this is happening, and this is what the science of reading has been bringing about for us. The next slide here is some research by Kilpatrick and Mathis. And this is really, to me, one of the most important pieces of data and study that we need to take a look at to apply directly to our classroom practices. So if you take a look there at number 1, that represents 30% of students who are capable of learning regardless of their environment. These are those students, you've all probably had them in class, who just, you tell them something once, they pick it up, they have it. They understand what the concept is you're trying to get across, and they don't need a lot of practice or repetition. Then you get to number 2. That represents 50% of students who are able to learn with high quality tier 1 instruction. And what we talked about in our last webinar, and again, what we're going to talk about today with language comprehension, is how important that tier 1 instruction is, because that's half of your students right there. As long as your tier 1 is strong, those students are going to be successful, and they are going to pick up the skills necessary to be strong readers. Then you've got number 3 there. That's 15% of students who may require a little additional time and support. You've got that high quality tier 1 instruction in place. They're still maybe not quite meeting the benchmark scores where you want them to be. So you may put them into a tier 2, or eventually, if they're not making progress, they're in a tier 3 intervention to help boost them up and give them some support to hopefully make it back to only needing, again, that quality tier 1 instruction. And then number 4 represents the 5% of students who have a severe cognitive impairment, who are always going to struggle somewhat, regardless, and are going to need that extra support. The important piece here, though, is when you put all those numbers together, 95% of elementary students, regardless of their background, regardless of their socioeconomic status, are capable of learning to read when they have those strong foundational skills. And so that's why we're focusing in on all of this in this webinar series, because we really believe that all of our students can learn and be successful. This was really a big eye-opener for us at the beginning when we saw this research, even when you take it and we were reflecting upon our own data. And so I think that's important for all of us to do too. The only way we can grow and improve is say, how can we get to this point? What can we continue to do to better our instruction, especially that 50%, that tier 1 area, to help our students grow and be successful? There's a great podcast link there at the bottom. It talks about a superintendent. Her school had actually gone from, I think it was 13% proficiency to 100% proficiency after implementing those science of reading practices in their school. And she had been a teacher at that building and then ended up coming back to work with those students. So No excuses for poor outcomes. Keep that in mind as we continue to go through this today. This is another study that really highlights this as well. It was a study out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They noticed that their schools were not succeeding or meeting the levels that where they wanted their students to be. So the scores in 2015 were what their proficiency levels were in reading at the time. And then they implemented science of reading practices, and then they reevaluated in 2018. And the reason this study is so important to highlight is they had some high poverty levels, some socioeconomics that needed a lot of extra supports. You can see here some of these districts there. We've got Fountain Hill there. They were at 90% poverty. And so when you were going through there, they were only at 28% proficiency in 2015. But then after implementing science of reading standards, they were at 60% proficiency. And the numbers are pretty typical throughout there. They were able to make a lot of growth in areas, regardless of the background of their students. The other reason we've been hearing a lot about this now is some of the media attention. A lot of this was brought about through COVID-19. I know nobody likes to hear about COVID anymore. We all want to put that behind us. But it really brought, kids were at home. They were with their parents, and there were parents saying, wait a minute, I thought my child, was doing relatively well at reading. And then they're hearing them in practice and thinking, this is not where I think that they should be. So that brought about concerns. The Sold a Story podcast. If you've listened to that podcast, drop a little thumbs up or a smiley face in the chat. Let us know. If you haven't, it's an excellent podcast to listen to that really brings about, what we talked about at the beginning, especially Jill mentioning the obstacles of the heart. That podcast really makes you, it tugs on your heartstrings. If you haven't listened to it, makes you reflect on maybe what you've done in teaching in the past and maybe how you've changed, or maybe why you're here today and why you want to learn more about this. And then since all the media attention, since 2013, actually, 40 states and the District of Columbia have passed different laws just to help teachers learn about the science of reading or implement and bring different practices into their schools to help them improve their proficiency levels when it comes to reading for all of our kids.
So big question that you can drop in the chat. Does the science of reading only tell us that we need to change our approach to word recognition? So just drop a quick yes or no in the chat for us. Does the science of reading only tell us that we need to change our approach to word recognition? All right, I'm seeing a lot of no's. So this is the big misconception around science of reading research. A lot of people think it's only phonics based or it's only foundational skills based, and we hear that so many times. And so that's why at the beginning when we say what is science of reading is not, and we say only phonics based. So you're correct. No, it does not only tell us we need to change our approach to word recognition. It also tells us we need to change our approach or reflect on our approach to language comprehension. We are going to start out with the simple view of reading. And again, if you were with us last month, we briefly went over this. And today we're going to be talking about the second part of the equation. So word recognition is only half of the equation. A lot of people view the simple view of reading because it's written horizontally like this. They think, oh, that means word recognition comes first and then language comprehension, and then we get to reading comprehension. However, both things should be taught in tandem, side by side, to lead to reading comprehension. The simple view of reading is probably the most important research that's been done in the history of reading research. It is very simple, but it's very profound. It was first proposed in 1986, so this kind of shows you how this is decades worth of research, and it came to be in 1990. And what it tells us is that word recognition times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And it's really important that we hone in on this multiplication symbol, and I'll show you why in a minute. But this diagram really helps us dig deeply into what some students really struggle with and what other students do really successfully. Here's a breakdown of the simple view of reading to give you a little bit more of an idea of why that multiplication symbol is so important. A lot of people think, oh, if they just have really good word recognition, they're going to be able to comprehend. However, if I have full word recognition here and I can read fluently, but I don't have the ability to comprehend spoken language, that's not going to multiply to equal reading comprehension. In the same boat, if I have really strong, or if I only have partial word recognition, and then let's say I have a little bit of background knowledge and I can comprehend a little bit orally, again, not going to multiply to give me full reading comprehension. So it's really important that we focus on word recognition and language comprehension at the same time, starting at the kindergarten level, so that we build them together, so that when we shift from learning to read to reading to learn, we have both there to be able to help with that transition. That leads us into Scarborough's reading rope. This is basically an expanded version of the simple view of reading, and this really shows us all the aspects of word recognition and language comprehension. Today, I'm going to focus on the language comprehension portion. These are all the components that we're going to talk about today that encompass language comprehension. It's not just about being able to read to comprehend. It's about background knowledge. It's about vocabulary. It's about language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. All of those different components have to be built in order to build skilled readers. So if I have a student who can't comprehend, traditionally I think of, oh, well, I'm going to give them a comprehension intervention, and I'm going to have them focus on cause and effect, and I'm going to have them focus on sequencing. It might not be that. It might not be a literacy knowledge issue. It might not be a skill-based issue. It might be that they're lacking background knowledge, or it might be that they really don't have a good foundation in language structures. So it's really important that we have knowledge of all of the aspects of language comprehension, and that we're able to build those in our kids. Another piece of this is that word recognition is what's called a finite skill. So once we have it, we have it. Once we're able to decode words and our brain is orthographically mapping words, if you were in our session last month, that'll make a little bit more sense to you. Once we have that in place, that's in place for life. So right now, we're able, as adults, probably able to decode any word that we encounter. Whereas language comprehension is infinite. We are constantly growing in that area, and we're constantly building our knowledge each and every day in our lives. And so it's important to get that word recognition in place at K2 while also building language comprehension, so that then we can continue building that comprehension as we progress through school. So one other thing here is it's really important to do this first through speaking and listening, and then through reading. So kids, I know a lot of times we think of, oh, we've got to teach them to read to comprehend in kindergarten, first, second grade. Really, that's about building language comprehension. Once they have the language comprehension and can do it auditorily, then we move into connecting it to reading. So that's a little bit different way of thinking about that as well. When we think about traditional methods of teaching comprehension, even 3 years ago, when I look at our schools, when I look at when I taught, when we talk to different administrators and teachers across the state or across the country, it's very skill-based. And so oftentimes in teaching comprehension, we teach a skill of the week or a skill of the month, and everything is focused around that skill. So let's say the skill is main idea. We're focusing only around finding the main idea and details to support that. Then a lot of times with guided reading, the last 20 years or so across the country, there's been a big balanced literacy movement. A lot of times we see that skill taught in whole group and then reinforced during guided reading groups. And then another way is just other text-dependent practices. So you're like, oh, this text really lends itself well to cause and effect, so I'm going to teach cause and effect with this text. And so we have become very text-dependent and skill-based when it comes to teaching comprehension. On the next slide, we're going to give you a little task. And so everybody, and Natalie Wexler actually uses this passage in one of her PDs, and it's just a really great example of this and was very eye-opening for us. But we're all on this webinar probably very proficient readers. And so we're probably all very proficient at finding the main idea of a passage. I'm going to show you the passage, and what you're going to do is you're going to take a minute, you're going to read it, and then in the chat, you're going to write me and tell me what is the main idea of the passage. So here it is. Much depended on the two overnight batsmen, but this duo perished either side of lunch. The latter a little unfortunate to be adjudged leg before, and with Andrew Simmons too being shown the dreaded finger off an inside edge, the inevitable beckoned, bar the pyrotechnics of Michael Clark and the 9th wicket. I'm going to give you a minute to type in the chat. What is the main idea of this passage? We've all learned about main idea. We've probably all been instructed in that. So can we find the main idea of this passage? Okay. Okay. I see Bridget said something about cricket. Awesome. And then some people are saying no. So definitely when we encountered this, we had no idea what it was talking about. This was actually taken from a British newspaper. And like I said, Natalie Wexler uses it in one of her webinars, and it is describing a cricket match. So kudos to you, Bridget. So if you know about cricket, you might not have any issue understanding this or finding the main idea of it. But let's think about this in the context of how we teach our kids, right? Okay, we're teaching a main idea. That's going to help them comprehend. But if I know nothing about cricket, I'm not able to use those skills or those isolated skills that I've learned in class to be able to find the main idea of this paragraph because I have no background knowledge around it. So that just really shows the importance of what we're going to talk about today and why that background knowledge vocabulary piece that is in that rope, why those are so important. This is something that cognitive scientists that have been studying reading for decades have known about for a really long time. However, as a nation, we've used the approach of teaching the skill of the week, reinforcing during guided reading, and doing those things, even though maybe there isn't a lot of great evidence to support that is the best approach. But again, it's not, I don't think it's to our fault. I think it's been a lack of knowledge around how to best teach kids to comprehend.
So what exactly is language comprehension? Obviously, it's that ability to understand spoken or written language. And we do this through background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. Those were those portions that Codi broke down earlier on Scarborough's reading rope, okay? So your younger students are going to use those oral language skills first to ask questions, process their information, interact with others. If you have ever been in a kindergarten classroom, you know that kids are constantly asking questions. They want to find out more. Or in the lunchroom, they're telling you a story. That's how they communicate. That's that first step, okay? But all of these above components that are listed here have to be built through that language before a child can have that ability to apply it to reading and then to actually be able to comprehend the text. It's important to note that a child's language comprehension actually supersedes a reading comprehension until the age of 13. So that oral, that spoken piece is so important to build these different areas, okay? And then that language comprehension, that becomes the main or the dominant process in reading. Once they've acquired enough, they've got that facility and that word identification, the comprehended written text, what would normally come through that spoken language. And kind of back to that rope, remember, this area, it's infinite. We are never done learning. You think about ourselves. If you travel to a new place, you learn about a new culture. Let's say you go over to Asia, you get to visit China. You're going to come back with new background knowledge. You're going to come back with maybe some different vocabulary. You've learned different things that then you can apply when you're reading different texts in your everyday life. If we move on to the next slide here, we're talking about background knowledge and vocabulary kind of here in our next piece. So we're going to talk about a study that was done in the 80s, and it was called the baseball study. And researchers, they really wanted to find out what was more important in comprehension. Is it those general comprehension skills, or is it how much the reader knows about the topic? And so I know this is kind of small on here, but they decided to take the students and break them into 4 categories. And I guess I should back up a second. They chose baseball because it was a middle school study, and they thought, okay, kids generally, they know quite a bit about baseball. So this should be a pretty fair topic for everybody in 7th and 8th grade. So they took them though, and they broke them down into these 4 categories. If you take a look, that first one is students who had high reading ability and a high knowledge about baseball. But then that second category, actually, who scored the best, and or not the best, the second best. The high reading ability and knowledge obviously had the highest scores. But after that, even those with a lower reading ability but a high knowledge of baseball outscored the students who had a high reading ability but the low knowledge of the topic of baseball. So that just goes to show how important that vocabulary piece is, and that we draw on all of that background knowledge to understand every single thing that we read or encounter. Um, the goal throughout all of this is really to make sure we're giving students access to as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible, rather than just practicing those skills like Codi talked about earlier, finding that text and being able to say, okay, we can really compare and contrast with this text. No, we want to focus in on that vocabulary and exposing students to as much as possible as we can. And the more naturally we're able to teach this, the better. You know, you think about sometimes with your students when you're reading a book, we don't think about it because we've got such a broad level of knowledge base. But I oftentimes, I think the very first time we did this presentation, I read a book or a portion of a book was called Silly Tilly. Well, it talks about yodeling. Okay, not a lot of kindergarten kids know what it is to yodel, but I guarantee you yodel once for them and they will know exactly what you mean and they won't forget it. So we have to be able to build those skills for them and help them to do better with that. And then moving on, oh, I was going to jump into Jill's slide. Sorry, Jill, take it away.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the elementary curriculum and how much time do elementary students spend each day on ELA, science, social studies, and math. Well, over time as a nation, as our reading scores have gone down, we have decided, well, increasing ELA minutes, that's going to be the answer. And so in our day, when we have to increase those ELA minutes, we have to decrease and lower the science and social studies time. We have to get those minutes from somewhere. And so many times we pull those minutes away from science and social studies time. Well, what researchers found out when they analyzed the data is they found out that the classrooms who spent 30 minutes more a day on social studies correlated with an increase in reading scores, whereas classrooms that spent 30 minutes more a day on reading, they didn't correlate to higher reading scores. And so why could this be? Well, it's because social studies is building the vocabulary and background knowledge that students need to comprehend the passages on the reading tests. And so knowledge is like Velcro. It doesn't just help you comprehend what you're reading at the time, it helps you retain new knowledge because knowledge sticks best to other related knowledge. So the problem is that skills and strategies approach that we've been used to, it can look like it's working in the lower grades, but the approach can backfire when students reach the upper grades. And this happens because the texts that we're asking the kids to read at the lower grades, they don't rely a lot on academic knowledge and vocabulary. And then students get to high school or the upper grades, and the texts do assume that deep knowledge and that deep vocabulary, and the students hit a wall. And so we need to be building knowledge and vocabulary at an early age, starting in kindergarten. And we do that through the language, through the listening comprehension part of it in those lower grades. And so this is why it's so important to have a good knowledge building curriculum in place that starts in kindergarten and builds each year. It builds on the knowledge and it builds on the vocabulary.
All of this leads us to the knowledge gap. And if you haven't read it, there's a great book by Natalie Wexler called The Knowledge Gap. And it just really talks about we oftentimes think that as kids enter kindergarten, there's reading gaps, or some have know more about their letters or have more book knowledge than others. But it really comes down to it being a knowledge gap for more affluent households or socioeconomics. I like to tell a story here. My first teaching job was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I taught it was pretty much 100% poverty level school. I taught second grade, and I was taking my kids on a kindergarten or a field trip to Lake Michigan, and we're going to see the museum, which is right down there on the lake. And as we're driving, I taught on 39th Street, probably about a 5 to 10 minute drive from the lake. We're getting there and they're saying, "We're at the sea. Ms. Bowman, we're at the sea." And I'm like, "Guys, that's Lake Michigan." It's the exposure, it's the experiences that kids have that oftentimes gives them that background knowledge to help them understand and know the text that they are being exposed to. So the more that we can put that in front of kids, the better. So how can we fill this knowledge gap? Obviously, we can organize our read alouds by topics, not necessarily by skills. And then spending a couple weeks on topics is so important. So I think we have as an example on here talking about sea mammals. They need to hear that vocabulary over and over again, get those repetitions in so that it really sticks in their long-term memory. And then they're able to draw on that knowledge or experience later on. And maybe it's not even just in that unit you're thinking, but it could be later on. If you're doing this in kindergarten already, it can be when they hit another unit that's similar in second or fourth or sixth or high school at grade. Making sure we're asking questions about the content, that brings it back to that content rather than the skills. Classroom libraries, just organizing them again by topic to make sure that the class has been learning about things and you're continuing to reinforce those. And then lots of meaty time on social studies and science topics. And we're going to talk even more about that. We've been very fortunate. We've adopted a new curricula that really brings the science and social studies to the forefront and hits on what Jill was talking about, with making sure we are giving that adequate time to those subject areas as well to build that knowledge for students. And then have them write about what they're learning. Writing is a very powerful way to get that knowledge to stick, bring it to that long-term memory, and help them to understand and grow in that area. So lots of things we can do within our own classrooms. However, I understand, I said we're very fortunate we were able to adopt some new curricula. There are some resources here. I don't think we've mentioned yet. Everything in this presentation that's underlined in blue is going to be linked, and that'll be sent out afterwards for you, so you'll have access to that. But the Knowledge Matters campaign is a great resource. We also have a great webinar there that's been broken down with some discussion questions that can just really help to lead your staff in some discussions about how we can close this knowledge gap at each of your school buildings and at your levels.
You may now be wondering, what is the explanation for what's going on in the brain? Why is this background knowledge and vocabulary so important with comprehension? So this is kind of a mental model of the brain, processes of the mind. And the important box that we're going to hone in on is here, this working memory box. And so really why knowledge is so important with language comprehension, it has to do with the way that we take in new information and how we process that. So the working memory is that aspect of consciousness where we're taking in new information and trying to make sense of it at the same time. Our whole goal when building background knowledge is to get information into long-term memory. So once information's in long-term memory, then we can truly say, hey, it's actually background knowledge for us. But the issue is that working memory here can only juggle 4 to 5 items at a time before it getting super overwhelmed and it can no longer understand and take in new information. Whereas this long-term memory box here, I'm going to kind of flip back and forth between the slides, it's potentially infinite. So once we can get information there, it's there and we can draw on it for life. So how do we as educators take information, help kids take information from working memory to long-term memory? Our whole goal in creating that background knowledge is to help kids create schemas in the mind. And if you're not sure what a schema is, it's basically a mental model that we all have in our minds of how we organize information. So you might have a schema in your brain for World War II. You might have a schema in your mind for the human body. And so you have bits of information about those different things in your mind, and those are called schemas. And then when you learn new information about those things, you withdraw the information from long-term memory in with the information you're taking in your working memory, and it helps your working memory not be so overloaded. So kind of like Jill said earlier, knowledge sticks to knowledge. All right. So if you have knowledge in there, new knowledge will stick to that knowledge and it can combine to hopefully get more information in that long-term memory. So, for example, we want kids, in order to transfer information to long-term memory, we want to be giving them plenty of opportunities to talk about it, to explain it to other people, to do a lot of things at that K2 level in an auditory way. So, if I'm reading them really high-level text with meaty science and social studies topics, and I'm giving them the opportunities to talk about it and explain it to other people and repetition on it, hopefully through those activities, because tasks that involve speaking and listening are natural and they don't pose a really big cognitive load, hopefully those activities are going to help them transfer information into their long-term memory so that they have it later when they learn more information about that subject matter. I'll give you a quick example here. In our curriculum, our students learn the human body is actually something they learn about. They start in kindergarten learning about the 5 senses. And then in first grade, they start learning about some of the body systems. And then in second and third grade, they get into the respiratory system and the circulatory system, and they start getting into the muscles and all of those things. And so they develop that schema for the topic of the human body in kindergarten. That information, some of that gets in their long-term memory, and then they have that to draw off of when they get into first grade, when they get into second grade, when they get into third grade. And so it's really important to think about how we can strategically and systematically build that, so that as they get older and all of a sudden, if they're in sixth grade and they're learning about the human body for the first time and they have no background knowledge, their working memory is going to be so overloaded that it's going to be really difficult for them to really fully comprehend what they're reading. And so when we build it from kindergarten, we then have that level of knowledge in their long-term memory that they can put into play when they transition from learning to read to reading to learn. So really just kind of thinking through how we can transfer that information to long-term memory for them.
Okay, so part of the knowledge building is actually writing about reading. We know that writing and reading go hand in hand. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the 3 pillars of writing for understanding. So these 3 pillars really help us to design kind of instruction that is knowledge building when we're doing writing. So the first is backward design. You need to know where you're going with the writing and the knowledge building. And so carefully planning the instruction to build that background knowledge. So the teacher's planning, you have to think about what that final writing is going to be, and then what types of knowledge needs to be built to get there. So when we're doing a topic, we just had in second grade where they were doing Greek civilizations and Greek mythology. So we were building all their background knowledge of Greek civilization and then teaching them about Greek mythology. And then when it came time for them to write their own myth, they were able to talk about if their character was from Sparta or Athens. And if they were from Athens, they were going to be in a democracy. But if they were in Sparta, they were going to be ruled by a king. And so they were able to pull all this knowledge into their myth, which was really, really neat to see. And so that leads us to the number 2. That is that students understand and retain material that's read or presented in science, social studies, and mathematics when they're asked to write about it. So building, as you're reading, having them write about parts of it as well. And then making the writing part of reading instruction, it also, we know this, the more you write about what you read, the more you are going to know and have to work with that text. And so as we were building that background knowledge of the Greek civilizations, we were having them write about Sparta and we were having them write about Athens, because as they were interacting with that text, then it was giving them deeper understanding. And then finally, that direct instruction. This is really important. In kindergarten through second grade, we have to allow our students time to become fluent in handwriting, spelling, and sentence construction, as well as typing. Because what happens if they're not fluent in these skills, they can't really focus their effort on those higher level composing skills. They need those transcription skills. So how to hold the pencil, how to write, how to spell and sound out words. They need those to get their thoughts on the page. And so we really need at those lower levels to practice those skills and become fluent before we're asking them to compose, because it really fills up that it really fills up their brain, so they can't think about, they're thinking more about how to make a letter than they are about what they're composing. Which leads us to the structures and models and graphic organizers and other instructional techniques. Those are excellent to use because they help our students plan ahead and sequence information and organize information. And so throughout that Greek mythology and that Greek civilization, they were constantly using graphic organizers to sequence events that would help then build and solidify that knowledge. So then later they could focus on that that composing part of the writing when they were writing their own myths. So really keeping in mind that writing has a huge part of the knowledge building. So writing about the reading.
Okay, why? Why not? How come? Kids are asking these sorts of questions all day long, probably throughout school and at home, to get what they want, to figure things out. And more importantly, they're using their verbal reasoning skills, which is what I'm going to talk about here next, to really develop that critical language skill. It helps them to function within society. Okay. So, an example I have up here under verbal reasoning is car, truck, van, donut, tractor, butterfly. Which ones do not belong in a group? Okay, obviously it's donut and butterfly. They're not vehicles. Okay, so that's that verbal reasoning. It's being able to allow readers to go beyond the literal, what's in that text, and to really understand things deeper, things that are implied or maybe abstract within a text. So some of the key components there are being able to make those inferences. Figurative language is a huge part of your verbal reasoning, just logical reasoning in general, integrating information, and then recognizing those abstract concepts. This is so important for kids because it helps them to grasp those context ideas in both fiction and in nonfiction text. And it engaged them in that higher order thinking and comprehension text. You know, when you think about Bloom's taxonomy, or you're thinking about your Web's depth of knowledge, this is where this really comes into play. I don't have it listed on here, but assessments really are measuring a child's ability to problem solve, their ability to be able to reason verbally and understand different things in the world. And so having strong verbal reasoning skills is going to prepare them for that academic work that requires the synthesis, analysis, evaluation. Again, all of those higher order thinking skills that aren't always generally going to come into play in the younger years. It's gonna make a big factor when they are taking the ACT or the SAT in their high school years too. It's really important to note though that students tend to do very well with verbal reasoning if they have that strength in background knowledge and vocabulary. That's going to be really key for them to make those inferences and read between the lines in the text.
All right, we're going to take a look at literacy knowledge next. This strand focuses on a reader's understanding of the broader concepts and structure of written text, such as print conventions, text structure analysis, knowledge of text features, an author's purpose. Those are the key components. But then why is it important? Well, this equips our readers to navigate the different types of texts and different genres. It helps readers to anticipate how information is going to be presented. And it also connects the prior knowledge to new information. And so how do we teach that, or how do we build that literacy knowledge? Well, building literacy knowledge, that strain requires explicit teaching and exposure to a wide range of texts and genres. And it's also this helps students develop the critical aspect of reading comprehension. And so we have to introduce and teach the basic elements of print. So even before students enter school, they may be building their literacy knowledge, such as understanding how to hold a book and how to flip the pages, the front, the back, and then that letters and words that they're starting to build meaning and that they hold meaning. In the early grades, we need our emerging readers to first build those simple print concepts, such as understanding that moving their eyes from left to right is how we read in English, and that we go from top to bottom, and that the books have an author and that they have an illustrator. Now, one thing that's important is that we can't assume that a child understands how a book works, because students come from different backgrounds. For someone who's teaching an adult to read, the lessons begin with the rules of reading, such as the direction you use to travel across the page. So we need to explicitly teach those print concepts. And then we also need to expose students to a wide variety of genres. So there's a researcher by the name of Jill Stake, and she said a strong curriculum covers fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in all their forms. Generally speaking, the more types of reading a student encounters, the more advanced their literacy knowledge becomes. So we have to expose our students to a wide variety of texts, novels, informational texts, graphic fiction. The kids are loving that genre right now. Newspapers, magazines, encyclopedias, all of those different forms of genres. And then we have to provide them with opportunities to purposely read them while paying attention to the text structures, which leads us to the explicit instruction in text structures of the different genres. Students need to learn the text features. They need to learn that nonfiction texts typically contain more elements like an index, a glossary, captions, section headings. Some have maps and graphic illustrations, whereas fiction books might have fewer text features, but they still have some, like a table of contents if it's a chapter book, or chapter headings. They also need to understand that, a narrative might have a plot or a setting, characters. So explicit instruction in all of those text structures are very important. Using graphic organizers, looking for signal words, and asking and answering questions about the text structure are important, which leads us, when you're using those graphic organizers, connecting that to the writing as well. So having students benefit from writing instruction in the same genre as the texts that they're reading. This allows the students to kind of internalize the knowledge and the features of these different genres and how and why the authors are conveying meaning. So really, if you're teaching a genre, also following up, and we kind of talked about that earlier, talked about putting that writing in there and attaching that to that reading. Very, very important.
The last portion of the reading rope, or strand of the reading rope, we're going to cover is language structures. And a lot of times we think of language structures, we know that that means grammar and syntax. And a lot of times we think of that being taught with writing, or maybe sometimes we teach it in isolation from writing. But this is really focusing on getting us to really think about and understand why language structures are important in meaning making and comprehending text. So here are the key components of language structures. I think we're probably all familiar with those, but why are they important when it comes to comprehending text? So when we think about vocabulary, we're really thinking about understanding and comprehending at the word level. But when we're thinking about language structures, we're thinking about sentence level comprehension. So not that readers can just grasp the meaning of individual words, but that readers can actually grasp the meaning, the relationship between the words and the meanings of sentences, which then filters down into that text level understanding and being able to read and comprehend longer passages. It then factors into fluency. So readers with strong language structure knowledge and knowledge of that syntax and grammar and complex sentence structures are able to more fluently read, because they know that when an italicized word comes about, that you emphasize it. They know what quotations marks mean and how to read that with expression. They know when to pause with various punctuation. And so they have more of that knowledge that helps aid in their comprehension. And then all of that also factors into writing skills, of course. because when we're stronger readers, we're also stronger writers, but these language structures are important with both. So how do we build those? We want to expose our kids to text with varied sentence structures. But when we do that, we really want to teach them about those sentence structures through the text that we're reading. So stopping to talk to them after a read aloud, guiding discussions about unpacking the sentence meaning, talking to them about the parts of speech and how those are impacting the meaning that the author is conveying through the text. It's really important to do that in the context of the book that you're reading with kids so that it's not just this isolated concept that they don't connect to reading and writing. There's also important, like we've talked about, to do explicit vocab and syntax instruction, teaching students to see the relationship between the words and their grammatical roles, again, so that it's not just an isolated thing. It's just really important to be intentional and make the connection between all of these aspects of the reading rope and student reading comprehension. It's not just about one thing, it's about all of these aspects intertwining.
Okay, you guys might be wondering, how in the world are we supposed to systematically and explicitly teach all of this and get everything put together to cover all of the language components within a lesson? So this is an example of a lesson from our curriculum that shows all the different components and how they tie together with language comprehension. So first, you're going to build that background knowledge and vocabulary by reading a story aloud to them. This is an example. It was a third grade lesson about the Viking Age. So it's going to give historical context. It's going to describe who the Vikings were, their way of life, their voyages. Then you're going to get into that vocabulary, those key words. In this particular lesson, they use a graphic organizer like Jill talked about earlier. They use a Freyer model. And if you click on that link, once you get it, you can see how that's set up in the boxes just to really define and explore the vocabulary. And then from there, they're going to tie it to the writing, which Jill talked about as well, how we were bringing that in to deepen their understanding of that vocabulary by writing with it as well. From there, you're going to jump into the language structure. The read aloud, obviously, it has lots of complex sentences, and there's an example of one there. And so you're going to break that down with the students. You're going to talk about that with them and make sure that they're following along and gaining that deep vocabulary, those verbal reasoning skills. You can pause, you can highlight different words that are going to highlight, the words although, and break it down and how they can connect their ideas together. And then at the end, they're going to practice constructing different phrases using those same structures, those same sentence patterns. And then this just tells some more about that. From there, then you can get into the verbal reasoning. Then they're going to ask those inference questions. Why do you think something? We're going to get into that higher level thinking there as well. And then they can discuss in small groups. And I think that's something important to remember about the science of reading is that, yes, it's very teacher directed, but you still want to have lots of time for students to discuss, to think, pair, share, to do different things so that they're able to really engage with the text. And then you're going to focus in on that literacy knowledge where they're introduced to the structures of the different texts. You're going to talk about the headings, the subheadings, the captions, the different features that are going to help them to understand and comprehend what they're going through. So they're getting that navigation from the teacher's perspective, but then they're able to apply that and discuss with one another how they can help them truly understand the content. We talk about here, we want to have those high quality lessons that really bring all of this together for the students, those strands of the language comprehension to ensure that they're building that deep knowledge, they're building that vocabulary and the skills necessary to become those fluent and skilled readers.
All right, I know we're right at an hour, so we'll just wrap up here with some of our data. So after our 3-year cycle of implementing a structured literacy framework, and last year was our first year really getting into language comprehension and the knowledge building, these are our outcomes from 1 year of that knowledge building. It was really profound to see our IAR scores go from 32% to 53% in 3rd grade in 1 year. Our 4th grade scores, our cohort, the previous year, they had performed at 32%, and then the next year in 4th grade, they were at 48%. You can see 5th, 6th, 7th grade, huge jumps there, 62%, 75%, 77% meeting grade level standards. So we saw huge gains in our data, as well as our benchmarking data for our STAR Star reading, 4th grade last year ended at 85%, or right now, sorry, we started the year at 64% in 3rd grade, 85% in 4th grade, 83% in 5th grade, and then above 80% in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So it's just really showing that all of the different things that we've talked about here today are really impacting our data and our students' comprehension overall. We also have some key takeaways here, just to like bulleted points. You will get this presentation. That way it's been a lot of information, but this really sums it all up. And then we also have some resources for you. Oh, sorry about that. I stopped screen sharing. Okay, but I think that's it for today. Those are all of our information about language comprehension. So we really appreciate you joining us and learning more about that today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Our information is in the slideshow.
Perfect. Thank you, Cody, Jill, and Heather. Really appreciate this in-depth look at language comprehension in part 2 of our Science of Reading webinar series. Why don't we get the slides to everybody tomorrow when I send the recording link? Does that sound good, Cody?
That sounds great.
Okay, so I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the slides so you've got access to not only the PowerPoint presentation, but the resource links that are involved there too. I know it's a little after 4 and people are probably anxious to log off, but if we do have any questions, you can type them into the public chat now. Appreciate all the thank yous coming in. That's very nice. But if you have any questions for Cody, Jill, or Heather, you can ask away. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and stop the recording here and we'll get this out to everybody tomorrow.